My name is Frank Cornelia. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Strategy Officer for the Colorado Behavioral Healthcare Council. CBHC began in 1967 representing community mental health providers, the community mental health centers, today of which there are 17 that cover the entire state, the only healthcare system in the state that is truly statewide. Each community mental health center has a service area that they are responsible to their community for providing services. We have the managed service organizations, the MSOs. There are 4 of those. They contract with the Office of Behavioral Health to manage a network of providers for substance use disorder services. And then we have 2 specialty clinics as well that are longtime members of CBHC, Asian Pacific Development Center and Servicios de la Raza. It's my honor and privilege to introduce the rest of our team today. On the advocacy side, we've got Moses Gurr, the Director of Policy and Member Engagement.
Frank, you muted yourself.
Yep, I was muted for a second. We've got Gil Romero, Principal of Capital Success Group, and Gil has been with CBHC, I'm just going to say 20 plus years now. Not sure what the number is, but Gil's been a former legislator, a former JVC member, tracks our joint budget committee issues. And then we are very excited, for those of you, who didn't get to know Karen Wick throughout the session, this may be an introduction. But we were excited to bring Karen Wick, the principal of Swift Strategies, onto the team this year. Karen spent a large portion of her career with the Colorado Education Association. She spent a few years with the Gill Foundation, and to the chagrin of many, missed lobbying. And we were lucky enough to be introduced to her through another member lobbyist, and she joined the team this year, and are grateful to have her support. So just an overview of the presentation that we're going to do today. We're going to, similar to previous years, we're going to do a look back, sort of a recap on 2020, both the legislative side of things and the budget side. Then we're going to pivot to the current landscape. Gil's going to walk us through some of the budget challenges that our state is facing. Karen's going to talk about some of the successes that we saw in the 2020 session, as well as to help us preview some of the key races. And then we're going to talk about our 2021 policy platform development underway. We're going to talk about advocacy in the 2021 session in the current environment. And then we're going to leave with a couple of action items. One, Moses is going to preview a new platform that we're using for communication for advocacy. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to leave you with a few action items today. So you've got some homework by the end of this presentation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Moses, who's going to talk a little bit about our role and how we operationalize our advocacy and support for members.
Thank you, Frank. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. And really, before we dive into all of the work that we've done in 2020 thus far and all the work ahead of us in 2021, I wanted to take some time to just talk about what CBHC does in the advocacy and policy space. And really what that is that we advocate on behalf of the membership organizations and, of course, the people and communities that they serve. So that includes everything from identifying where we need to focus our attention, where we need to develop policies to support your work, all the way to actually lobbying and advocating for those policies and getting that engagement and communications around those different advocacy strategies. In the regulatory space, we do a lot of work with the different state departments to make sure that implementation of different bills is appropriate for the intent and is workable for our member organizations, is the best possible outcome for the individuals and communities that they serve. In the legislative advocacy, we do a lot of work around tracking all the different bills that are introduced each year, leading and supporting different organizations around those different bills, organizing and preparing testimony, getting you all to that testimony room. And we're always appreciative of when you're able to join us in the Capitol or virtually, potentially in the future, for that different types of advocacy. And of course, getting into the nitty-gritty of participating in the bill writing, the amendment process, the lobbying, building those education and opportunities for partnership with legislators and the committees that they sit on. And for the budget, we do a lot of that similar work, working closely with the JVC and Capital Success Group to really understand and track the budget, to educate the JVC on the decision items that affect our membership and the communities they serve, and to really lobby and participate for the different decision items and to make sure that we have a budget landscape that is the most conducive to the success of Colorado's behavioral healthcare system. And then once the session ends, the work is not done in the advocacy space. And of course, 2020 was an interesting year with a session timeline going a little bit longer than we're used to, not just the 4 months. So the work never really ends. And there's, of course, a lot of work to do for bills that were passed, to join bill signings, do outreach to communities and media, stakeholders, and of course, all of our membership as well, on what this bill signing means, what we can expect as far as implementation, and engaging in different stakeholder convenings and partnerships, collaborations for implementation of different types of initiatives that were passed during the session. And throughout the year, we work to outreach legislators, recognize the champions we've had in the session, and to build that relationship with the policymakers as well as the coalitions that are out in communities that help us achieve our priorities during the session. And we're always so grateful for the work of the membership in nurturing those different relationships, joining those different partnerships, and we welcome your support as well as your outreach and how we can be helpful when you navigate these different types of relationships and partnerships in your communities as well. Frank, is there anything that you would add for the role that we play during and around the session?
No, I think you cover the basics. From here, we're going to go into the 2020 policy platform. We're going to talk a little bit about, what our priorities were heading into the session. Just to add a little bit to what Moses just described, throughout the year, we're obviously engaged with our members in various board committees to try to understand exactly, the specific issues that are opportunities for opportunities to expand what you do, to identify those barriers or challenges that get in the way of serving your community, and so we do that throughout the year. We did a survey this year, a formal survey. We had a dozen or so, I think, specific policy recommendations. We put those into categories for our 2020 policy platform, and you see those categories on your screen right there. We wanted to expand access to care, and we've heard this, for years now, about the need to support a behavioral health workforce. It was our #1 policy priority in 2019. We were able to get a 2% rate increase for community behavioral health providers. Significant dollar amount when it comes to budget advocacy, but not to the level that we need to get to overall. And so that was, again, and heading into the 2020 session, our members, said 2% was helpful. We've got data to show that we are woefully behind the private sector, and increasingly behind the state employee salary survey as well. And so our rate increases have not kept up with inflation. Our previous budget analyst did a nice job of putting together data to support our ask. We went in to the 2020 session with a 5% rate increase ask of roughly $12 million. We wanted to, in addition to a simple rate increase, we also wanted to pursue other policy initiatives around workforce, and so worked with the opioid and other substance use disorder interim committee on loan repayment opportunities, increasing career pathways for community behavioral health providers, and just overall, looking at whether it's through legislation or regulation, trying to identify where we can reduce regulatory burden or administrative burden that really frees up our workforce to do the things that they that they really want to do, which is serve individuals in their communities. System transformation. I should say too, on expanding access to care, we had a couple of pilot transportation projects that originated from Senate Bill 207 in 2017 with great results, and we were a part of some stakeholder meetings that we'll talk about in a little bit when we get to some of the legislation about this concept of secure transportation for individuals experiencing mental health crisis. So this is sort of our proactive policy platform, and you'll understand where things go sideways in a little bit when we talk about the budget and the impact of COVID-19 on the session, in addition to a couple of other variables that we'll talk about too. But nonetheless, we headed into the 2020 session looking for those opportunities to expand access to care. On system transformation, one specific recommendation that CBHC members put forward through the opioid interim study committee was to consolidate the individual commitment and emergency commitment statutes for substance use disorder. So historically, we've had two separate and similar processes for alcohol and one for other drugs. And that has been a source of confusion for providers, for regulators, and for families and clients as well over the years. And so it was our goal, in partnership with COPA, the Colorado Providers Association, and their members, to eliminate and consolidate, eliminate that bifurcation and consolidate that language. And so that was one of the recommendations we put forward and led throughout the session. We knew that the governor had charged CDHS Executive Director Michelle Barnes with creating a task force on behavioral health, and so we knew heading into the legislative session again, we knew that there wasn't going to be legislation run in support of that yet, but that was something that we were paying close attention to and participating on. And then finally, advancing well-being and community resilience was the last category. And what this meant for us, we knew the Mental Health Practice Act was sunsetting, and they needed to reauthorize the Mental Health Practice Act. That's the act that governs the 6 behavioral health license categories in the state of Colorado. That's a heavy lift that CBHC put together a small group of subject matter experts with representation in each of those professional categories, with the eye towards, again, workforce, trying to streamline the pathway to licensure for individuals both in Colorado and for those that may be seeking job opportunities in Colorado from other states. And then mental health first aid was a priority for us as well. And this, we had some opportunities come out of the school safety committee that Representative Daphne Michelson-Janae chaired, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that was a priority for us as well, to expand access to mental health first aid training. Moses, you want to move to the next slide there? So the 2020 legislative session, you can see this picture in the background. Hopefully you can't read it too clearly. It's unfortunate that the Capitol looks like this today, and they're doing a lot of work, hopefully, to try to clean up some of the damage that was done to the Capitol, but this was truly a unprecedented session. And I feel like I say that every year when we give this presentation, that this was a unique session, but this one was historic in the sense that it really felt like there were 4 seasons to our session. We had a very active pre-session. So, I describe all these things about our 2020 platform. We want to go in to achieve these things for our members. And then as we do that, others are doing that as well. And so late November, early December, we were notified by Colorado Counties Initiative, or Inc., CCI, that they were going to introduce or planning to introduce legislation on the behavioral health system around the concepts of transparency and access to information. And so that took up a lot of our bandwidth in the early part of the pre-session. There were multiple stakeholder meetings. Some of the largest stakeholder meetings I've been involved with in my 8.5 years with CBHC. If you know CCI, they're the membership association for all of Colorado's, no, maybe not all, most of Colorado's counties. And so it's made up of, commissioners, and they've got an extremely large boardroom. As you can imagine, they can hold 60 plus folks. And then we had dozens and dozens of people on the phone. So again, like I said, one of the largest stakeholder meeting processes I've been a part of, and representatives running the gamut in Colorado. That's the pre-session. Then we went into a regular session, and then March, everything shut down for COVID. And then, again, I'll let Gil and Karen talk a little bit about that. And if you want to make a remark about, just sort of the unprecedented nature of taking a recess in a public health emergency, and some of the constitutional questions. But I would really, the fourth part of the session, the fourth season, I would describe as the Black Lives Matter and police reform portion of the session. So we had the death of George Floyd, and a coalition of legislators and stakeholders brought forward police reform in the form of Senate Bill 217. And that really even had another brief shutdown as the protests threatened the safety, property, and physical safety at the Capitol. And so that was how the session wrapped up in June 15th. So Gil and Karen, I don't know if you want to make any remark on the historic nature of the pause due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Sure, I'm happy to add in some thoughts. I think just more than anything else, it was based on a policy change that had been done when we last had the flooding occur, and they made some changes but never actually used it. And so there's a lot of controversy and partisan debate over the ability to even take a recess. But what it's basically said, as long as that we're in a state of emergency for a health kind of a public health crisis, they can pause. And so I think Gil might have some thoughts too, but it's sort of leading the question of what happens in January when we come back in the 2021 legislative session. I think several of us would assume we will still be in that state of emergency for a public health crisis, and what's going to happen. And I think some of those things we won't know. And I'm not sure how much what's already occurred provides a roadmap to help us figure it out. But it was definitely historic, interesting, and we found lots of creative ways of working during that time.
Yeah, Moses, we'll keep moving. These were CBHC's priority bills and budget action. So they correspond again to our policy platform. I mentioned the targeted rate increase request of 5% that totaled roughly $12 million. Expanding secure transportation. That was both potentially a JBC action or an opportunity through House Bill 1284, the Mental Health Colorado bill, to develop a license structure for secure transportation. Under the system transformation, I mentioned the SED consolidation. That was one recommendation within a larger set of recommendations included in Senate Bill 7. We had Senate Bill 42 that I would throw under that category. That was the reauthorization of the mental health disorders in the criminal justice system task force, a task force that I think is roughly 20 or 25 years old. And so I know Moses is the chair of that group. Karen did a lot of work with the lobbying team to see that reauthorization happen. And then under the Advancing Wellbeing and Community Resilience, we had the mental health sunset bill that I mentioned and mental health first aid. That was actually Senate Bill 1, which is an indication of the priority nature of that bill in the concept being to advance mental health first aid trainings in school in preparation for the nationwide rollout of youth mental health first aid. Next slide. So these are some of the other bills of note. Moses mentioned our tracker. We've got quite a few other bills. These were some of the ones that we tracked closely or got engaged in. I want to move on for the sake of time so we can talk about the current state and the future state, but you can go to our website at cbhc.org and find our tracker, and please, at the end of this, we'll share our contact info if you have any questions about that. So I want to turn it over to Karen to describe, just how we sort of managed to find some successes despite all the challenges I described. So Karen?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I mean, one of the things to really highlight, in this roller coaster of a session that was so different than anything we've experienced, I think at the end of the day, when we looked back at where we ended, it felt like we ended up with some pretty good successes. I'm going to call it the best glass of lemonade we could have had from the 2020 lemons. Overall, Frank started talking a bit that we were heading into session facing a really challenging bill that was coming from Representative Singer and the Colorado County's organization, CCI. I think where Representative Singer was coming from a good place of wanting to see some greater transparency, but in all practical purposes, it really would have driven huge administrative burdens, would have likely have seen shifting of resources, financial resources away from services for patients and members in order to be these administrative burdens and dealing with it. And it really was because of early engagement from members like you all to be able to communicate with the practical results that would occur, share your insights, really help to advocate. We kept a lot of our focus on Representative Singers, but there was also outreach among county commissioners in getting information back. Frank talked about these very large coalition meetings that we were part of. We had several of you all engaged in that. And from all of that hard work and the hard work of the CBHC staff, we were able to really stall this bill. It was not in any kind of ready for the showtime kind of place when the COVID recess hit. And so we were able to make sure that this bill stayed on the shelf, didn't get introduced. And then in the off session since then, the CBHC staff had been heavily working with many of you on the contracting process to provide some more of that transparency that the advocates were seeking, that it sounds like now we are not expecting this bill back for next year. So I think the hard work that had occurred, especially on that bill, really paid off big time when we got to the end of the day. I think that also showed up, and Gil will talk more about the budget, but really in the member engagement and education of JBC members and other members that have really cared about behavioral health issues, about the services we provide, the criticalness of it, the what was happening on the ground, really made a large impact in where we ended up and able to defend and protect some of our dollars that were coming down overall. And so I think, a theme really of the first two pieces that came from our success was the overall member engagement and really sharing of your expertise has a demonstrable impact. And those were something we were really grateful for. The last piece, I think, with House Bill 1411, this really was, I think, a great culmination of having great advocates in the legislature for behavioral health with Senator Brittany Petterson and Senator Rhonda Fields on the House side, Representative Daphne Michelson-Janae and Tracy Kraft-Tharp, being able to take quickly advantage of federal dollars that were made available for the legislature to spend from some of the money that came down. We were able to work with a team, both of those legislators, the CBHC team, and many of you to capture over $15 million of the federal funds and direct it towards behavioral health. And so while some of our other bills may have stalled out early, like Senate Bill 1 is a good example, it got caught up in sort of the purge from the coronavirus of trying to reduce the legislative load that was going on. When House Bill 1411 presented itself, we were able to identify funding within that to go help direct dollars to mental health first aid and still accomplish the goals that we were seeing in Senate Bill 1. And so it was really pretty, it was pretty amazing at the end of the day. I mean, we ended up with like 3.5 million for substance use disorders treatment under managed service organizations, 3.25 million for community mental health centers for unexpected expenses related to COVID. And the list goes on. 2 million for services to school-age children that are being provided by community mental health service centers. So I think all in all, what we were able to do is really help plug holes and come out of a legislative session where Gil will describe the budget in a moment. That could have been so much more dire and worse for our communities that we are really able to take advantage of and make sure we could get resources into them. Other things you would add, Frank?
No, I'll just that just it was remarkable. Like you said, glass of lemonade after all the lemons that were handed to us at, in the 2020 session. So this is a preview. This is a sneak preview that even our legislators aren't aware of yet. These are our two 2020 champions that CBHC plans to recognize. State Representative Daphne Michelson-Janae of House District 30. She walked in to the legislature saying that she was going to be behavioral health. She was going to be a behavioral health champion, and she's left no doubt that this is her key. This is her core issue, and she carries a handful of behavioral health bills each year. And so this past year, as Karen mentioned, she was a prime driver of the of House Bill 1411. But she's, I don't even have time to tick off all the legislation that she's passed in relation to behavioral health issues. She was a co-prime sponsor on ending conversion therapy, I believe it was last year. And like I said, just a number of other issues. She really, from her seat as the chair of the Safety Net School Safety Interim Study Committee, she really just had behavioral health in the forefront, in terms of that committee, when there was some tension about where to put resources, and that some people, some folks wanted to increase security, but she really brought this mental health, behavioral health, emotional wellness lens to the school safety committee. And really, we can't thank Senator Rhonda Fields enough for requesting the mental health first aid bill, Senate Bill 1, but Representative Michelson-Janae was, the driver of those bills that came out of that committee. So we're excited to recognize her. And then State Senator Dominic Moreno. You cannot emphasize enough how important Joint Budget Committee members are, especially in this time. And I know Gil will talk a little bit about that. But Senator Moreno has been extremely responsive to our team and Gil and his advocacy on behalf of the statewide system with the JBC. He's been responsive to Rick Doucette, the CEO of Community Reach Center. I know that they had a meeting on the floor regarding a bill, and Rick was able to come down to the Capitol and pull him off to talk about some of our needs in relation to a bill on the ACC system a couple of years ago. So Senator Moreno has co-sponsored just about every behavioral health that has come his way, and we're excited to recognize him in 2020 as well. So we're going to shift to the current landscape. We're going to hand things over to Gil to talk about the budget. And really, that's the piece that we have not probably stressed enough, that has shaded all the work that we have just described. And so excited for you to hear the report from Capital Success Group. Gil?
Thanks, Frank. I hope everyone can hear me. A couple of things. One, I think, Frank, you did a great job of just painting sort of this picture of the 4 seasons that we all experienced during this 2020 session. And I think both describe pretty accurately exactly how things happened, especially in that last portion after they came back. What I'd like to do very quickly is take a look back at the budget, and then and I think that's really helpful in looking back at the budget to kind of tell us, what we might see in the 2021 budget. The first thing I would say is that, I think it sort of rolls off your tongue that the Joint Budget Committee and the other 94 members had to deal with one of the biggest deficits in the history of budgeting, a $3 billion deficit. And what I thought about as I was preparing my comments is I tried to capture some of the things that were said during the debate, and there was a lot reported on, and the Joint Budget Committee spent a lot of time, working through some of these things. But I tried to capture some of the things that were happening. And one report said, it's been a grueling and head-spinning effort. JBC members choked on emotion as they cut college investment for newborn children, salary funding for state employees, and hundreds of millions of dollars in school budgets. And here are some quotes that I captured during the budget process. And this first one is from Senator Moreno. The gains we've made are going to take a big toll through this budget. Honestly, I think it's going to take years to get them back to the level they were. Senator Moreno, a Democrat and vice chair of the Joint Budget Committee, said people are going to encounter it very, very personally. The chair of the committee this year, Danae Escar from Pueblo, we used our heads, but it would be impossible for us to make these decisions if we hadn't used our hearts as well. They spread the hurt as much as they could, she said. We took a little from a lot. But I think the most profound statement in this process, as I was looking through, many articles that were written, really was from Senator Rankin, and I think it captures exactly what we face. And I'm going to come back to this statement. He said, "It is a historic thing. It's likely not to happen again for at least 1 year." And so that's where we start my presentation. I think it was a historic thing. What the Joint Budget Committee did was extraordinary, and I think what the rest of the legislature did. It wasn't just one bill that they did to budget the budget or balance the budget for the 2021 session. It took 40 separate pieces of legislation that accompanied the budget bill in order to balance the budget. No surprise where the cuts came from. The biggest cuts came from K-12, higher ed, and health and human services. If you look at sort of the percentages, K-12 took a 14% cut, higher ed took a 58% cut, with the caveat that much of that cut was offset by CARES money of $450 million. In health and welfare, cuts to hospitals, cuts to providers. The provider fee was reduced by 1% across the board. There was a recommendation, just as a side note to this, is that the JBC analyst, Eric Kurtz, had actually recommended a higher, and in fact commented, I think you need to cut providers by 3 to 5%, and was surprised when the Joint Budget Committee resisted that recommendation and only took a 1% cut. That's a placeholder for us to think about when we look at next year's budget. One of the big things that I think people forgot in this process is they approached in January, they're already having difficulty balancing the current year they were in. And as they got further into the session, as they got into February, March, they knew they had to balance the previous budget. And so they took the reserve down from approximately 7.25% down to 3% in order not to take cuts in the current year they were working on. And that's a really important thing to think about, because that's something that then Governor Hickenlooper really gave a lot of attention to. Before he left as governor, he wanted the reserve to be, or the savings account for the state to be at 10%, but it was at 7.25%. So what are the takeaways that we can look at from last year's budget going to this year's budget? The takeaways are: one, the Joint Budget Committee used one-time money to balance, and it's important to emphasize that that was one-time money. They took money out of reserves, they took money out of unspent money in cash accounts, but they're not going to be able to use that trick again for next year, and that's really important for all of us to remember. The reserve now is hovering around 3%, and maybe a little bit lower when it was 7.5. Just think about your own savings account and for people that are trying to balance their budgets in this state that are losing their jobs, their savings account is going down. The state is in the same position. They've had a healthy savings account, but they had to use a lot of it to preserve and prevent some of the deeper cuts that occurred. And finally, the third takeaway from this budget that they balanced is they used a lot of federal money to do it, including the money in House Bill 1411. So as you look forward, and I know I'm moving pretty quickly because we have a lot of ground to cover yet, what are the things we need to think about as we look into January for the budget? First of all, there's an election. And as any election comes around, elections obviously have consequences and there are changes. So we will have to see whether or not we will see changes to the current makeup of the Budget Committee, the committee that I follow day in and day out during the session for CBHC. We'll have to see whether or not the current membership stays the same, but if it does stay the same, it's a strong Budget Committee with a lot of experience in terms of Senator Rankin and Senator Moreno, with Representative Escar and McCluskey, with Senator Zenzinger and Representative Ransom. So it's a good, strong committee. They hung together and worked in a really bipartisan way to balance a $3 billion deficit. The other thing that we have to look at, and we'll be following close attention to, is the revenue forecast for this next month. This September forecast will be presented in the third week in September, and we'll have to see where the state economy is. I've had conversations with both the chairman of the committee, Representative Escar, and the president of the Senate, President Garcia. And I think for at least the reports that they're hearing is that although the economy is starting to pick up in Colorado, it's certainly not where it was prior to COVID. So there will be additional revenues, but whether or not that will allow the state not to dip into the reserve to balance the current year budget remains to be seen. And finally, the 2021 session. The one thing that I've had discussions with leadership on for the last month and a half is what the session is going to look like. And I think for all of us that are advocates, and all of you that are advocates for CBHC, that we ask you to contact your legislators. That what at least at this point, we know is it's not going to be the same legislature that we've seen in the past. It's going to look more like that fourth part of the season that Frank talked about. I think there's going to be limited access to the Capitol, and there's going to be limited access to legislators. And for us, at least for our firm, we obviously want as much access as we can to the Joint Budget Committee members. So I'll end with what I started with in terms of what the budget will look like for next year. I think Senator Rankin is correct. We're going to face a really tough budget. There are no tricks left. There's no one-time cash to look at. The reserve, our savings account, is as low as it's been in the last 10 years. And the uncertainty that we have right now, and it really kind of depends on this election, is whether or not we'll get any bailout or any help from the feds. So that's where we stand right now with the state budget, Frank.
All right, thanks, Gil. Let's move on from that uplifting topic. But no, that was a great report. And I mean, it's really important for CBHC members and those viewing this presentation to understand just how big the challenge is when it comes to the fiscal, environment heading into the next session. So we want to shift a little bit to preview some of the key races and get some potentially some predictions from our team here. So we're going to start with the state Senate. And Gil, I think you're going to lead this one, but we just want to give you a sense of some of the races that might determine the power in the chambers. So Gil, do you want to make any comment on the state side or Senate side? Gil, you're on mute.
Sorry, Frank. I'm not seeing your screen if you have them up, but you may have to help me. The key races that we're looking at in the Senate, Senator Tate, who was term limited, that is an open seat this year. The one thing that, or at least the one seat that the Democrats feel that they have an opportunity to make a gain in terms of a +1 is that particular seat. The numbers are much closer. That district has become more competitive. So that one is really, at least in the minds of the Senate Democrats, is a possible pickup. The other seat that Democrats have tried for many times to try to change from Republican to a Democrat is the Priola seat. Kevin Priola is running again. He's a moderate Republican. That one is probably at least at this point, in my discussions with some of the pundits and people that are doing some of the polling and tracking, is that Kevin Priola probably will keep that seat, even though they're putting a lot of money and effort into that one. The Crowder-Lopez seat, I know Arnold's on the line. He probably has a better feel for this. I was on a call last night, fundraiser for Governor Hickenlooper, and they were talking about this at the very beginning about this race. But I still think it will be a difficult one for the Democrats to pick up the Crowder seat, but it may be more competitive. And all of these seats that I'm talking about, at least on the Senate side, the two things that you have to really realize, the things that are sort of change the trajectory and make it much more difficult, is because we have obviously a presidential race that's going to take a lot of energy and will change the number of people that will change the turnout. And then we have a very, very competitive, very important U.S. Senate race with Hickenlooper and Gardner. So that will change the turnout. And so some of these seats where we've said, these are the likely outcomes, you never know what's going to happen in terms of turnout. And finally, the last seat is the Weld County seat where Barb Kirkmeyer is running. That one's, the Democrat in that and that seat has been running an incredible race, raising a lot of money. But I think that's really a difficult district for a Democrat to win. Barb Kirkmeyer, who is a county commissioner from Weld County and served in a lot of different capacities and was a cabinet member for Governor Owens, that would be a difficult one for the Democrats to pick up. But again, you never know what happens with the turnout for a presidential race and a U.S. Senate race.
Thanks, Gil. Karen, how about the House?
Sure. I mean, unlike the Senate and the House, there's no chance that the overall power of the House is going to flip from Democrat to Republican. So there's just too many seats that Democrats currently have in the lead, and then there's about 6 seats that are up that are competitive, if you can see that, but that still won't change the fact that the Democrats next year will still hold the speakership. The Republicans will still be in the minority. What we're really seeing overall in the battle within the House Republicans is going to be their leadership of who's going to be minority leader, and the results of some of these races could help really determine that overall. If you're going to see it really swing and stay with Patrick Neville, who has been kind of ultra conservative, Rocky Mountain gun owners kind of style, or if you're going to see more of a moderate Republican leadership really rise up overall. There were some primary battles that happened earlier where the more moderate candidates won. And from that, it'll be interesting to see what happens overall on the Republican side of the leadership. There will also be as a result of the elections, we'll start seeing who's going to have be named speaker, because there will be a leadership battle that'll happen on the Democratic side too. Right now, Alec Garnett is in line for that. There are other members who are potentially challenging him in that race, or to also try to be majority leader, so number 2 in line. And so that'll be really interesting to see overall. But looking more closely to November, these 6 seats here really are the ones where both parties are heavily focused on. In 2018, it was really a surprise when House District 25 and House District 27 both elected Democrats. In the past, both of them have had a higher portion of Republicans registered, but both Representative Cutter, Representative Titone pulled out wins in the end. It's going to be really interesting to see where they both land in November. In House District 25, Representative Cutter does have the upper hand on funding. She's a little better known. I think she's done a really good job of her of kind of choosing her legislation and building that path. Don Rosier is a former Jeffco County Commissioner, so he does have some name ID, so that'll be an interesting race. In House District 27, Representative Titone has just done a really good job making her name known, taking advantage of her win, and she's putting up a really good fight. She has definitely a money advantage. However, Vicki Prine is kind of moderate, and so in 2018, the candidate was not as much, so it'll be interesting to see how this one goes. The other 2 seats right now, House District 37, that should say Tom Sullivan. Tom Sullivan is currently the incumbent. He's really running a good race. He's being challenged by Caroline Cornell. I think for the most part, she's gonna have a really tough competition there. Tom's been coming out really strong. House District 38 would be really interesting to see overall. While the district leans Republican, this has become a very top seat that the Democrats want to spend money on and want to see if they can gain. David Ortiz is a really interesting candidate. He's a vet who is disabled. He's paralyzed from the waist down. He really just has been a strong advocate within his community, and it's going to be that's going to be like one of the real races to watch. In House District 43, Kevin Van Winkle and Jennifer Miskowski. I think that there's definitely the Republican advantage here. Van Winkle definitely has some money, but Miskowski is giving him a run for it. So I think that'll be another one, especially in its normal area of the Douglas County, Parker area. what's going to happen in that race overall. And then lastly, down in Pueblo, House District 47, Bree Buentello, who is the incumbent. She's someone close to my heart, not just because of her work on behavioral healthcare issues, but she is a former educator. She left the classroom as a special ed teacher to be able to step into this role. She's the part of Pueblo that is the donut around Pueblo City itself, so it's the whole county area. It has been a tough seat. It has been a long time since that was previously held by a Democrat. I believe it was Buffy McFadden who was the Democrat, and then there were several races where it went to some Republicans. And so in 2018, when Representative Buentello picked it up, it was really quite a successful win in years in the making, especially years of several teachers running. So having her win was great. But I think luck is also going to give her a really run for it. I mean, it's going to be interesting. Overall, that district tends to lean more Republican, and you know, we will see at the end of the day. It's one of the districts where really, if you remember when we did the recalls of state legislators around gun issues, it was an area that really drove a lot of that. So we have a lot to see, and it'll be really interesting.
Yeah, and then obviously we have the United States Senate race. Senator Cory Gardner is up against former Governor John Hickenlooper. Do we want to make any predictions on this one? Karen, Gil?
I'll just share the polling data. Right before we started this, I looked at what was the latest poll, and there was a poll coming out from a group called PPP that still had Hickenlooper at 51% and Cory Gardner at 42%. So however we want to take polls, I think we can take them. I never count out Cory Gardner. I mean, he made a surprise kind of win when folks didn't think he would win in his last election, but you know, a lot of the data is all pointing towards Hickenlooper winning. Gil, what would you add?
I would agree. I think that you know, I was on a Zoom fundraiser with Secretary Salazar, Ken Salazar, and Joe Neguse, and they're behind in fundraising, but they hope to make up the gap. Obviously, there's a lot of independent money that's being thrown at this race, very negative race. I think everybody's seen the commercials. But my takeaway from the fundraiser, and maybe it's just because Governor Hickenlooper was at Ken Salazar's house in Alamosa, and air's different, but he seemed pretty confident that they're going to be okay. And you know, it'll probably tighten up a little, but I think they're raising a lot of money, and obviously they're expecting a huge turnout. He said that one of the things they're doing is they expect to increase voter registration, and they have all these people that, you know, for their ground game. So they seem pretty confident, you know, at least where they're at right now. So.
All right, thanks. What's on the next slide there? So Gil touched on some of the, you know, advocacy best practice in 2021. It's going to be a different, you know, advocacy session. I don't know, Gil or Karen, we're running out of time here, but if there's a, you know, just knowing that, you know, physical access to the Capitol may be restricted. We may have, you know, the flu on top of, you know, the COVID-19. And so just cannot reiterate enough sort of the importance of being flexible and, you know, establishing that local relationship. And, you know, one of the things we wanted to say here too is just find out what, be intentional about the communication preferences of your local, you know, elected officials. Do they like to text? Do they like to email? Are they comfortable with social distancing, you know, masking, if you want to do in-person visits, all those types of things, but just be intentional about their preferences for communication during the session.
And Frank, I'll just give you my 30 seconds really quickly. You know, if Rick's still on the line, you know, one of the things, one of my takeaways from lobbying the Joint Budget Committee this past year is I was trying to get a text into Senator Moreno, and he did finally respond to me, but it was probably several hours later in the evening, and he apologized because he said he had received 85 texts on that particular issue. And so for all of us, you know, many of these people are running this year. What I would say is one of the things we've got to do this year in terms of our advocacy is we've just got to make sure that you have great contacts with your legislators. You know, try to get their cell phone numbers, ask them what the best way to get a hold of them. If they have a separate email, separate Gmail account rather than their legislative account that they feel that they'll look at more closely and get a more timely response to you. Those are the things that you can get from them now before the session starts. I don't expect the session to be any different than that, as Frank described, that fourth season where it's going to be very limited access.
All right. Tentative policy priorities. This is you know, something we put together, but based on, you know, everything we've heard this summer, this you know, the past few weeks, obviously we've heard about the budget and protecting funding for direct services. Can't say how critical enough that is. I mean, that potentially drives cost in other areas if we are cutting behavioral health funding that's known to reduce higher cost settings like jails and emergency rooms. Mental health first aid. National Council has chosen Colorado as a pilot state for some mental health first aid advocacy, and we hope we have a call coming up with National Council, I believe next week, hopefully to put some details on what that might look like here in Colorado. We're tracking very closely the Behavioral Health Task Force, and they've got, sounds like, some special permission to request funding and potentially legislation to work on the implementation aspects. They just voted to create this behavioral health administration, so we may see some legislation related to the recommendations that are coming out of the task force and the blueprint. Obviously, we talked about the workforce. There's no dollars, and in fact, we're probably going to have to you know, advocate against provider rate decreases. In the meantime, we can do as much as we can to reduce regulation to try to lift that burden upon our workforce. And then just, again, generally supporting behavioral health workforce. We had a conference call with our members today. Retention is a key issue that was on the top of mind for the leaders of our system, both in doing everything that they can to avoid layoffs, but also fielding resignations just based on life circumstances. Those are some of the priority areas that we're going to be looking at. And it's, you know, this supporting behavioral health workforce may look more non-traditional than other things that we've done in the past, and including, you know, joining other coalitions to advance childcare opportunities for people that are on the front lines, first responders. So, all subject to change depending on September forecasts and different issues that we hear from our members.
We'll talk about Basecamp for just a little bit. So in 2020, we started using a new collaboration and project management platform called Basecamp. And how it works is that we can create different landing sites, websites basically, for different groups of our membership. So we have all sorts of different groups. We have marketing, communications, data and finance, and we also have one for LCAT, the Legislative Community Action group that we run. So with Basecamp, we have all sorts of functionality. We can have forum-style communication. You post a topic, people respond. We can have live chat. We can have document sharing and document collaboration. That's where we're currently hosting our legislator directory, for example. And it's also an opportunity for us to post action alerts. So if you have, if you are a CBHC member, you should have a member of LCAC as well. And that member of LCAC will have access to this Basecamp. So we're asking that you identify who the individual in your organization is that has access to this Basecamp, so that we make sure we have somebody who we can know is keeping track of the different action alerts and documents we're posting on there. And we're always happy to help anybody learn Basecamp or become more familiar with it as they join the group.
Thanks, Moses. Our last slide, our homework, hopefully I haven't lost too many folks. Before you go today, we want you to, as Moses said, identify your internal advocacy team, and that's, you know, the key leaders of your organization, those board members that get involved in policy and advocacy. And then, as Moses said, identify your legislative and community action committee representatives. Those are representatives of CBHC members that participate on our legislative advocacy distribution list. Second item is to develop those champions that, you know, so important that Gil and Karen talked about. So reaching out to your state and local elected officials. And, you know, the important thing here is, you know, we're looking at the state level, obviously, but also, you know, the importance of your county commissioners, your municipal leaders. Make sure that you're nurturing those relationships as well. Because as we saw in the previous session, those relationships are beneficial. I mean, just to be able to have an avenue and a channel to describe how different policy recommendations might affect your business and your ability to serve your community. Developing community partners is key. And then make a plan for safe or virtual site visits. After the November 3rd election, you know, I think you'll find that people might have time, but you can get involved in elections right now. Gil mentioned virtual fundraising. Those are all things that you can get involved in. And then, as we mentioned, we'd like you to make plans for virtual site visits. And all of this is leading up to, you know, potential hybrid virtual Hill Day in January or early part of the session that CBHC is working on plans to adapt and be flexible for our advocacy day at the Capitol. So those are the homework items. We want to thank everybody for joining us. Gil and Karen, thank you for all of your expertise and your insight. Thank you, Moses, and the rest of the CBHC team. I want to thank all the CBHC members that help support our work throughout the legislative year. We say it over and over again each year. We could not be as successful without your engagement and your support. Your relationships are what we use to leverage our work at the CBHC level. So thank you. If you have any questions that you want us to answer, please enter those into the chat. And this presentation will be posted as a part of the training and development site on our fall conference. That's September 30th to October 2nd as well, 100% virtual conference. And we will have some resources on the resource center in relation to all the things that we talked about today. So thank you again for joining.